Hello, hello. I don't know why I was so small for so long. But now we're here. It's Jeff with True Crime Myths, Legends, and More podcast. Thank you guys for joining us. I know it is April Fool's Day. I'm wearing my sideshow best today. But today is not a joke. We've got Troy Taylor here. He's going to be with us here in just a few minutes. And we get to discuss one of my favorite subjects. You guys know that I love true crime, and we'll talk about that a little bit too today. But I also love the sideshow. It is one of my passions, and I don't know how. Anyway, we'll talk about this a little bit more because I read some things in Dark Carnival, one of Troy's newest books, and I don't know how I didn't know some of it before, but it's really, really cool. And it just reminds me how much of my background seems to have centered around the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, or the World's Fair there in Chicago. Just a fascinating time period in history, and I love everything about it. So anyway, without further ado, we're going to bring on Troy, who this guy has, at the last count, 153 books published. I'm on book number 2. Well, technically book number 3. And I just don't know how it's even possible. Maybe I just don't have enough brain power, but man, it is not an easy task. And I certainly applaud him on that. But without further ado, we're going to bring on Troy. How's it going, Troy?
Great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I could not believe that when I was there at the shop this last week, and Trey told me that the last count was 153.
Yeah, just barely. One just came out. So yeah. It's hard to explain how. It's just, I always try to explain to people that it's my full-time job. So it is, all the other little things that I do, from the museum to, ghost tours and events and everything. That's just sort of the side stuff that is spawned by writing books. And so, when someone else says, well, how do you have time to do it? I say, well, how do you have time to do your job? You're there 8-9 hours a day, every day. And that's what I do, 8 or 9 hours a day, almost every day. So, plus when you're self-employed, you really don't put in a 40-hour week anyway. So it's more like 80, or something, but yeah. It's fun. So I can't complain about any of it at all. It's a blast to do. I'm lucky to get to do it. And so I've always got, I have a huge list of things that I want to get to. So I'm hoping that I live for a long time. So I can at least get to most of the stuff that's on my list. So I'll have to have my son finish them if I don't get them done. That's all I can figure.
I'll have to tell you that, I have I was at the museum last weekend because I was in Kansas City, and I came back through St. Louis, and on the way back to Ohio, you get to a little town called Alton, Illinois, and there's a bunch of cool stuff that happened there that I had no idea about. but so, of course I had to stop, and I had been dying to come and see the museum anyway. And since I left, I think I brought 5, 6, 8 books back from the museum. And I was like, so far I am halfway through the 3rd one.
Oh, good. Good. Yeah, that's quick.
Yeah. I've always been a really fast reader to begin with.
Yeah.
But just really, really engaging. I love the way that you write. So it's really easy read. I read Dark Carnival, and it was incredible.
Devil's Carnival. Yeah, Dark Carnival likes Todd Browning. So we got
it.
Yeah.
Devil's Carnival. Okay.
Which is funny how it got its name. So it has nothing to do with the devil, but yeah.
Nothing at all.
No.
So tell us that, because I'm
Oh,
curious.
well, I had got I had gotten, I do a podcast called American Hauntings, and we um, we were doing an episode or a season on New Orleans and ghost stories and true crime and things in New Orleans, and we had gotten a review that had been posted about the show that said that everything that I did was part of Satan's carnival and that I should be ashamed of myself, et cetera, et cetera. And I said to my co-host Cody, I said, Satan's Carnival, man, what a great title for a book. I got to find a book that I can write that is going to have this. Well, has been several years ago, and I had never found anything. And then I'm looking for a title for this book, and I thought, what am I going to call this book? Because the subtitle is, like 20 lines long on purpose. It's meant to be funny. And then, I thought, what can I call it? And I thought, well, Satan's Carnival doesn't sound good, but Devil's Carnival will work. So it has nothing to do with anything except it has carnival in the title, but I just used it anyway. So that's how it ended up
That's
on there.
amazing.
So yeah.
But if you guys are out there looking for anything related to circus history, the sideshow history, it is my number one go-to from here on out. It is an
Well,
incredible history.
it turned out to be massive. And, I could have probably have written, at least a half of that much more, but
Yeah.
eventually I just had to stop. I mean, it was like you can't put in every single thing that you've ever found about carnivals and circus. You have to stop somewhere. So yeah, it was a really fun book to write, probably one that took me longer than, I don't know. I think I've written 2 or 3 books in the time it took me to write that one. It was a lot, but it was so much fun to do that. It was one of those books that I wrote that I hated to be finished with.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to be done, but I knew I had to be done at some point. So I just had to finish it. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I've had a love for that kind of stuff my whole life. And people who know me find like funny little things that I've inserted in there that they recognize from me saying, like, it's not a circus without elephants. I don't know how I got onto that the other night. I was talking to some friends and they're like, yeah, you said that like 12 times in the book. I said, I know, but it's true. It's not a circus without elephants. And anyway, my family, I mean, I blame my family for like my entire career pretty much. My great grandfather was a police officer, Irish immigrant police officer, so he was full of every kind of story you can imagine. He's the one who got me started on ghost stories and true crime, and he would tell me all these stories when I was a kid that I know I was too young to be hearing, but you know I'm sure my mother's hair would have curled if she'd known some of the stories he told me, but they all stuck with me and it put me on the path that I'm on. And then I had uncles who were firefighters. I had uncles who, had done one thing after another. And then I had uncles who used to go out in the summer with the carnival. And I mean, it was just food booths, but the point is that I got to go along with them sometimes. And I got to see, and this was the dying days. I mean, we're talking
Yeah.
about mid to late 70s, early 80s. And I'm out there roaming around on the fairgrounds, getting to go wherever I wanted to at a time when there were still shows. I mean, sure, there weren't much in the way of like, what we consider freak shows today. I mean, there was, the world's smallest lady who really wasn't who I knew, so that wasn't all that exciting. I mean, these people, so the shows aren't that great. But in other words, though, you still got to see, the girl that turned into the gorilla. And, I mean, it was stuff that I could not, there's no way to duplicate this stuff for anybody today, which is why I wanted to write about it, because that stuff's just gone now. I mean,
Yeah.
it's, political correctness has killed so much of it. And, and in some cases, rightfully so, but in others, no. I mean, that was one of the points of the book, was to make sure that people knew that, a lot of these people that were, going out and putting themselves on display were making a better living than most people were in those days. They walked away rich and retired and lived the rest of their life in comfort because they decided that what else were they going to do?
Yeah.
Again, I use the example of, a guy with a third arm growing out of the middle of his chest can't get a job at the local grocery store. But I can tell you made a lot more money than the guy at the local grocery store did.
Yeah.
Yes, there were lots of cases of abuse and lots of cases of people being taken advantage of too. And I tried to point that out as well, but that's human nature. I don't think that has anything to do with freak shows or with sideshows. That's would have happened in any business and does happen in any business. So I
Absolutely.
don't know. So I spent a lot of time defending, the idea of it while also understanding why we don't have it anymore. Why we don't have these things.
I know some of my earliest memories were stories that my dad would tell me about going to the freak shows.
Mhm.
And one of the stories that he would tell me all the time is the girl to gorilla, right? And
Yeah.
he would tell me, you'd go into this room and there'd be this beautiful girl in this cage, and that they would do whatever they did, and all of a sudden she would turn into a gorilla, and there was a gorilla standing there, and then all of a sudden the cage door opened up and everybody ran out of the
Yeah. That's
theater,
the best, man.
yeah, and you're like, dude, that's great entertainment,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
people running for their lives because of this gorilla has escaped, and
Yeah.
it's just we don't see that kind of imagination anymore.
No, no. I
We-
think the last time I saw that myself was, I wanna say around like 83, 84 was the last time. I mean, I'm sure there are some still floating around out there, but they're not common, that's for sure. I remember when some of that stuff was still maybe not common, but at least you'd get to see it. But now the entertainment area at your state fair is nothing like it was when I was a kid. And I
yeah,
can't imagine what it was like to people who are, my parents' age and what they saw when they were kids. We only have memories and photographs and things of that. I remember what it was like when I was a kid, and that stuff's all gone. So
I
it's too
I
bad.
think one of the things that I had one of my kids say to me a year or two ago. We were talking about going and seeing, like the Grand Canyon and going and seeing Mount Rushmore and stuff like that. And the response was, "What do I need to go there for? I can watch
Exactly.
it on the internet." And I'm
Exactly.
like,
Yeah.
"That's not the same, man.
No, it's
It's
not.
completely
No,
different.
no. When
What
I
the hell
was
are
a
you
kid,
talking
yeah,
about?"
when I was a kid, my parents loaded us up like Chevy Chase's family in vacation literally into a station wagon, and off we went. I mean, we drove everywhere. We drove, out to the Grand Canyon and to Yellowstone and California. And we went everywhere. And, you're talking about, again, late 70s, early 80s. We take my stepdad was a farmer. So, there's nothing to do at the end of the summer until things dry out and it's time to start, harvesting everything. So he always had some time off, and we would go out and do stuff, and we got to do everything. We got to go to all these places and see all these roadside attractions that just don't exist anymore.
Yeah,
So I mean, that was the reason I've always wanted to open a museum, of just weird stuff because, well, I'd been collecting it for so long anyway, so I mean, it was all in my house, and it's like I would love to be able to display this stuff and do something like the stuff we used to go to when I was a kid, and so that's kind of what it became. And so the book that I finally decided to write just kind of went hand in hand with it. I don't know. One probably might not have happened without the other. I know that if I hadn't finally opened the museum, I'm not sure I would have ever written the book. I probably would have just daydreamed about, oh, what a cool time that was, kind of thing. And, absorbed all the information and never really printed it. But it was kind of like, once I had the chance to do something I really wanted to do and open that museum, then I had this book that I'd always wanted to write, and they just seemed to go together. And so that's how both ended up, really. So,
wow. Yeah,
yeah.
it's super cool. For those of you that have not had a chance, if you get there to Alton, Illinois, and you're driving through there, or if you just want to go there, it is an incredible place. It's $5 to get in. Go there
Can't
and
even
walk
buy
around and
coffee for
check it
that,
out.
as I always say.
Yeah, it is a really, really cool spot. He's got all kinds of sideshow stuff up there. Also, there's several cabinets with, some old medical equipment and things like that and descriptions. And then you have the serial killer,
Yeah,
the
and
true crime
literally,
stuff.
I hate to even tell you this, but literally the day after you were there, when I got back into town, because I missed you. Just for everyone who's listening, I missed Jeff's that weekend. I was out in Wichita that weekend, and I wasn't around when you were there. So we've only had our contact is always through email and everything else. But literally the day after you were there, I started work on the expansion of the true crime and serial killer section. I added a new wall of cabinets. And I know, and I had been collecting a bunch of stuff that I wanted to add to it, which I did, and it's open
Nice.
now, a week after you were there. But yeah,
So
so
that's
sorry about
okay.
that. But now
That
you
just
got a
means
reason to come back.
absolutely. I'll have to come back. So I was telling Trey one of the things, and I actually have two copies here. I have a paperback and I have a hardback copy of the book Stranger in a Strange Land.
Yeah.
Now, that book, from what I understand, one of the more recent documentaries that's come out about Manson, and you have that display of Manson there. And I'll tell you my history with
Much
that here
bigger
in a
now.
second. But that book specifically, they said there's a couple of the family members that said that he would carry that book around with him. And in that book, it basically lays out the entire plan for the Manson family. From the LSD being used to control people, the whole family of love is all in that book. Now, I've
Oh,
not
wow.
read, I have two copies, but there are several Manson family members that say that Charlie carried that around like the Bible.
I
And he
think I read
used,
that in that Chaos book that they just
yeah,
did that documentary of. Yeah, that
yeah,
we kinda laid out I mean, I think most people who studied Manson or know much about the crimes know that Bugliosi's version of events was, just to self-serving and, sensationalistic to get him some coverage for this trial.
yeah,
I think everybody always thought there was more to it than that. I've always kind of built every time I write about Manson, I build it all around music. And while it may not be completely accurate, there's a lot of music stuff involved. I mean, the fact that they went to, Polanski and Sharon Tate's house where Terry Melcher used to live, that's too big of a coincidence, considering how mad Manson was at Melcher,
oh yeah,
so yeah, but I did read that too, and that is fascinating. Because
yeah,
I had no idea before I'd heard that anything about Heinlein's book. Yeah,
yeah.
that's really interesting.
Yeah,
So
it's a fascinating piece of that story.
yeah,
How much truth is there? I don't know.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
but but it's interesting to think, well, where did Manson get all this from? Because when he was in prison and he spent many, many years in prison, he
yeah.
read a lot. That's where he got a lot of his philosophy from, because he
Right,
was a prolific reader. He had
right,
nothing else
right.
to do while he was in there. So he's reading all the time and he's getting all these ideas and all this
Well, the
stuff. And he,
Dale Carnegie stuff that
yeah,
he used to win friends and influence people, or rather to win cult members and influence them, essentially.
yeah.
But yeah,
So
so it's crazy.
here's my connection with Manson, and you don't know this previously. People on the
Oh,
podcast have
yeah,
heard this a bunch, but my dad met Manson in the early 60s before the
no
murders.
kidding.
And so I grew up with the story of my dad meeting Manson, and Manson did not like my dad at all. They actually my dad met a couple of the girls, not any of the girls that were involved in the murders later on,
Mhm.
because Manson would travel around the country with his harem, like,
Yeah.
and so he was hanging out with a bunch of these girls, and the girls went up to my dad and said, "Hey, are you want to go to a party?" And my dad said, "Yeah, sure, I'd love to."
Why
Some
not?
hot girl talking to him.
Yeah.
And he said, "You got any drugs?" And they said, "Yeah, but we got to go talk to Jesus first." And he said, "Okay, the hell
Okay.
is
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
whatever."
whatever. Yeah.
And so
California, 60s, whatever.
so they took him over to this park bench, and Manson had come out of the hotel and he sat down and he was playing his guitar. and they went and talked to him. I think he said 2 words to my dad. He turned to the girls and he said, he can't come.
Oh,
Now
God. Hey, I'm
my
so sorry. My
you're good.
doorbell is ringing. Give me 10
You're
seconds.
good.
Sorry.
See, this is what happens when you're on the show. So yeah.
Well, worse, once I had a pizza delivered in the middle of an interview. So it could be worse.
That's
Sorry
okay.
about that.
If the
One of
pizza
those
is good.
things. Yeah. Ah,
So
God.
so anyway, they Manson turns to the girls and he says, that guy can't come. And my dad is pissed off at this point. And
Sure.
now my dad is 6'2". At the time, he was about 220. And Manson is all of like 5'4" and 120
Right.
pounds.
Yeah.
And so my dad leaves with his buddy. And he turns to his buddy and says, I think I know where that party is going to be tonight. We'll go back and rob this guy of his drugs. So my dad's intent was to go and rob Manson. And so they went back that night to go look for the party, and they couldn't find it. They must have moved hotels or
Probably
something.
just as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
in hindsight, yeah.
the funny thing is, with that being said, my dad, all of his life, would have, if Manson would have had a little bit more forethought, my dad would have been Tex.
Yeah. Yeah.
He wanted
Good point.
to be
Yeah.
involved.
Yeah.
And so, but like, it was just one of those things. My dad is a very strong personality, and that was never going to work with somebody
No.
like Manson.
No,
He needed to be able to control the people around him. And
right.
my dad was not one of those guys, and he could read it immediately, the way that he approached him. And so, but I grew up with that story. So I always had this connection with true crime and with Manson specifically because of that. Around my house growing up, it was always Cousin Charlie, right? Even though they never had any good words,
Right.
and my dad didn't know for probably 3 years until the murders happened. And they were watching TV, and the murders had happened the night before, and it was all over the news the next day. And my dad said, holy shit, that's that guy we saw in the park. And he calls up his buddy and says, hey, are you watching the news? And he said, holy shit, that is the guy. So then they knew his name was Charlie Manson.
Yeah.
But before that, all they knew that they were calling him Jesus.
Yeah. Right. Right.
So, it's a funny story, but at the same time, I grew up right outside of Philadelphia, and half of my family is all Italian, and they were all mobbed up. They all owned restaurants. They were all fronts for the mob in the 70s. So I grew up around a lot of this true crime. So it's always been fascinating to me. I've always been right in the middle of all of that stuff, and always really had an affinity for it. So the other book that I read that I had a chance to read was on one of my other favorite things was the Houdini book.
Houdini. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So good. I did not realize that Houdini performed there at the World's Fair. I didn't realize that was the early part of his career, and him and his brother were there together.
Yeah.
And so like when I read that in the book, I was like, okay, so you got H.H. Holmes there.
Yeah,
And
that's what I
all
was
the
gonna
stuff that
say,
he
yeah.
did. You've got Houdini that's there with his brother, Hardin, and then you have all of the sideshow stuff that really kind of culminated there.
Yeah, I mean, it
where it was part of
became
the
the
midway.
carnival, the basis for the traveling carnival,
Yeah.
which, I mean, the circus had been around already, but the carnivals really hadn't. You might get a little bit of a side thing that went along with some of the circuses, and you did have sort of the freak shows and things, but you didn't have the actual carnival until after, they put together that area for the fair, and then did it again in St. Louis with the Pike. And it was just a big, I mean, it was, I don't know, you could almost call it like, like a permanent carnival, set up, for a year. And then the idea was, well, we can make this thing travel. We could do this on a traveling basis, just like the circus. And so it began, Yeah, but yeah, the fair is a big deal. I mean, you got also don't forget you also have like the pretty much the start of the American movie industry, which
Yeah.
started in Chicago. Well, not started in Chicago, but everybody fled to Chicago trying to get away from Edison, you know, to get away from Edison's, trademarks and copyrights. So,
So
you know,
so you don't know this yet, and I'll tell you in the sideshow game, one of the cards in there is that Edison shows up at your sideshow.
oh
Uh, right? And you
yeah,
lose a bunch of stuff, but there's also another card about Edison's thugs showing up at the sideshow and like
yeah,
dismantling things.
yeah,
Because for those of you that don't know and think that Edison was a great guy and did all, like Edison, was like a mob boss back
yeah,
then,
pretty
right?
much. Yeah.
This guy like ran all the rackets. He basically stole everything from everyone that he could,
Mhm.
and then you have, of course, we've got Nikola Tesla, who also was at the World's Fair there and did lots and lots of things, and really was the inventor of most of the things that we now give Edison credit for.
Right.
But just
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and but one thing that the only thing that I, love blaming Edison for that I can't, it turns out you can't really blame him for is killing poor Topsy the elephant. They may have used his power, but he didn't have anything to do with it. And
Yeah,
everybody has always said, "Oh, Edison killed this elephant and it did it on film." Well, so they filmed it with the Edison camera, and the electricity was powered by Edison's company, but that's it. It
yeah.
really wasn't Edison. But yet another elephant taken down. So
One of the cool things, one of my favorite pieces of my own personal collection is I have an authentic ticket from the 1893 World's Fair
I've got one
here in
too.
my room.
I've got
Yeah, I
one
was
too. Yeah, mine has
uh,
Abraham Lincoln on it,
uh,
on my ticket. So
I've got George Washington.
Oh yeah, and I
Yeah,
haven't
I've got
seen
a
a Washington.
Washington.
I've seen two Lincolns. I have not seen a Washington, but yeah, I have a pretty good collection of stuff. This is weird. Here's a weird little thing. I bought a bunch of Prohibition and 1893 World's Fair paper stuff that had been framed from an estate sale that was run by John Wayne Gacy's last attorneys. So there's a weird
Okay,
thing that goes, yeah.
which is
So
really
yeah,
funny because I
yeah.
just had I just had Karen on the show, which was
Oh
one of his
yeah,
last attorneys.
that's so funny. Yeah, we were some friends of mine ready to move out of this house they were in, and some friends invited me to come because she was just going to sell off whatever was in the house, and just ask her if she can give you a price. And I picked up all this Prohibition stuff that she had, and I picked up a bunch of paper World's Fair stuff, and she's like, "Oh, $50 or whatever, a bunch of it." And I mean, it was all very affordable. And yeah, so it's become part of my collection. So
That's super
I can't
cool.
can't pass it up. So
I've got on my wall behind or on the other side of the camera. I have a 1913 program from Barnum and Bailey's
oh,
that
cool.
has all of the sideshow freaks in it.
Oh,
So
that's
you
nice.
have Grace Gilbert is in there, her picture and a bio and everything. It
Nice.
has all kinds of people. Tommaso is in there. It's super super cool. I was really excited to pick that up from a buddy
Yeah,
of mine who does
yeah.
a bunch of I end up getting cabinet cards and stuff from him all the time. Matter of fact, I'll see him this weekend because I'll be in Richmond, Virginia, and he's from the East Coast. So he
Okay,
does all the East Coast shows. So
okay.
I'll be curious to see what he has for me.
It's
And
not James. His name isn't James, is it?
that's a good question. I think it might be actually.
His
No,
last
no,
name.
no, it's
Go ahead.
Adam.
Okay.
Is his
All right.
is his
Different guy
first.
then, because I know one. I also know a guy out on the East Coast who I get a lot of cabinet stuff from too.
Yeah,
That's so funny. I got a bunch of original Tom Thumb stuff and the Hilton sisters and stuff from him. So yeah,
nice.
you have to know somebody anymore.
Yeah,
I mean, it gets harder and harder to find that stuff. because
Yeah.
so many people didn't keep it. I mean, they just tossed it. Once it was over, they pick something up and then didn't hang on to it. And it's like now it's finding it gets harder and harder all the time. So it helps if you have somebody who really is a collector who also sells stuff. That I found that tends to be my best bet. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I love all the one of the things with the new sideshow game is I made sure that the cards are tarot sized
Oh,
because it
nice.
mimics the size of
Yeah.
cabinet cards.
Yeah, sure does.
And
Yeah, that's
and I
great.
wanted to give that feeling because for those of you guys that don't know out there, when you went to the sideshow, they would sell you little souvenirs, right?
Right.
And often they were cabinet cards. They were photos that may have had their name on it and said,
Right.
uh, fattest man in the world or
Right.
whatever,
Right.
on their whatever their moniker was, and you would take that card home, and lots of people kept them. Some people threw them away, but they were almost like baseball cards back
Right.
then.
Right. Well, and
And
it was a way for the performers to make some extra cash. I mean,
yeah,
they were being paid for the tickets when people were coming in, but selling the little booklets or selling the photos and things, that was a way for people to take something home and make a lot of money for them because
yeah,
stuff was cheap to reproduce back then. I mean, once you had it photo taken professionally, as most of them were, you could have it reproduced for almost nothing at the time, so yeah, it's and so finding them now is very cool, very
yeah,
cool.
yeah.
So,
I love it. I just last time I saw my buddy, I picked up I actually want to reframe it, but it's more from probably the late 70s. But it is a bunch of photos and a couple postcards from the Headless Woman
oh,
attraction.
yeah,
And
almost
so
as
that
good as Spydora. So,
yeah, yeah. Uh, So like, just cool little things like that. Like on
yeah,
my wall, I have one of the Barnum and Bailey's advertisements with all the sideshow freaks on it.
yeah.
That one I think was actually, it's really funny because I have the exact one that you have in the book.
Oh, yeah,
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 when I was
yeah,
flipping through, I was like, oh, I have that one on my wall.
yeah, yeah. It's always cool.
Yeah. I was like, man, that I know that image. But yeah, so you have done what I think is really unique because you don't just do like you have Devil's Carnival, but you also have a ton of other books relating to murder and true crime and all of that. Uh Before I jump into that, I got to tell you about one of uh I didn't know that you had written this because I didn't realize how much stuff you've done in New Orleans history
Oh, yeah.
and some of the ghost stories around New Orleans. But I was down there and I had an ex that was with me at the time, and she had a dream about the Lalaurie or no the Lalaurie
Lottery.
mansion.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and so she had a dream about that and about one of the servants there jumping off the balcony
Oh,
and dying, right? And so like she tells me this dream and we're sitting out there in front of the house and she's pointing out what she saw in her dream and she's crying out there, very emotional because it's very real for her.
hmm.
And I didn't know, like I had no idea at the time that that was an actual account, that
Right.
that had actually happened there.
Yeah.
And then I went back and we were there for some reason and we were flipping through, like in one of the stores there, we were flipping through one of the books and found the account of that happening,
Yeah.
nearly word for word as her dream. And I didn't realize it. I was standing there at the store and I'm flipping through one of the books and I was talking to Trey and I was like, holy shit, it was Troy's book. I was reading there in the store. Like that was 10 years ago or so, 15 years ago. So funny.
Yeah.
But so apparently we've been floating around each other for
Yeah,
the
yeah,
last
for
at
quite
least
a
15
while.
years.
Yeah.
So I know I'm currently reading because I told you I'm
Yeah.
I don't know, a third of the way through
Yeah.
Murder by Gaslight, which is about
Yeah.
H.H. Holmes.
Right.
So I have Holmes has always been the most fascinating for me. I've done
It
a
is
lot
for
of
me too. Unfortunately, that book needs some updating. Because decided to do I did a full Patreon podcast just for subscribers of H.H. Holmes a couple of years ago, and I researched a lot of stuff and found out that some of the stuff I have in that book is not accurate. So,
Ooh,
I feel like I need to update it at some point. I just haven't had time yet. So, but it's
okay,
coming. But I will tell you that in advance. Yeah. So, in case
nice.
you're going to hit me with anything that it turns out is not accurate. So,
No,
it
I
happens. It happens when you've been doing it for as long as I have. Sometimes you have to go back and fix things.
yeah,
So,
for sure.
research has become, a lot easier than it used to be. Put it that way. So,
So I got far enough into the part where you mentioned that he wasn't Jack the Ripper.
oh well, yeah, that part can stay the same. That hasn't changed. Yeah.
So it's really funny, and at some point I've talked to Jeff Mudgett, and I'll
Mm.
have him on the podcast as well. But there have been some people I disagree with them on a bunch of different points, but there have been a couple conventions that have wanted to get the two of us together to debate one another. So
Oh
there has
yeah.
been some talk about that, and I again do not believe that H.H. Holmes was
Yeah.
Jack the
I
Ripper.
mean, there's actual physical evidence that shows that could have been, but
Absolutely.
yeah.
And I love that you pointed out one of the biggest things is the crimes are completely different.
Yeah, that
Like,
don't even remotely resemble each other.
no.
It's almost like
So,
somebody just decided, I mean, to just pull like the most famous things happening at the time and just throw it together.
yeah,
I mean, yeah, it doesn't work.
yeah.
But
And I love that you also pointed out one of my other favorite facts is that his first daughter was born right after, in 1889, but
yeah.
he would have had to have been impregnating her right about in the middle of the
Yeah,
spree.
in August of '88. Yeah, there's
Yeah,
just no way yeah. We don't know everything he was doing, but we know who he was doing, in August of 1888. So, and it was not a prostitute in England. So, yeah. Yeah, I know. It's like it don't it's one of those things that, and all with, all due respect to Jeff's novel, because I don't think he ever planned. I don't honestly think he ever planned for this to take on a life of it. Really don't.
yeah,
That happened because TV producers got a hold of it and went, "Oh, hey, we could turn this into a show." And I think it sort of got out of control. But just because people see stuff on TV does not. I mean, you could put out a documentary and put any spin on it you want to,
yeah,
and just like my other big thing is the George Hodel Black Dahlia thing. No, he wasn't, and here's why. And there's again solid evidence that while this guy was a freak and a pervert and all kinds of stuff, doesn't make him the Black Dahlia killer, nor does
yeah.
it make him the Zodiac killer or all the other things his son has blamed on him, who must really hate his dad. But that's all I can figure. But yeah, that every time you say, "Oh, we're going to talk about the oh, we already know who did it. It's not unsolved." And what are you talking about? Oh, it was that doctor? No, actually, it wasn't. And here's why. You know, but again, people see it on TV or they, read it in a magazine, and it becomes gospel because TV producers don't bother to research anything. They want someone
Oh,
else to
yeah.
do it for them. And so, they just don't bother. And
Well,
I
see,
just, yeah, it's crazy. So,
I, I tell people this all the time because I write too, but I always write from the standpoint of, listen, the only person that's opinion that matters is yours.
right.
You should be informed. Don't believe me. Don't
Yes.
believe the documentaries. Go out there and research it for yourself. Figure out what you actually believe. And then you can talk about things. Then you
Yeah.
can say, I know this, or this is
Right.
what I believe about this situation. Because
Right.
just being out there and saying a whole bunch of random shit that's
Yeah.
regurgitating information that came from some
Exactly.
documentary doesn't mean shit
Exactly.
to me.
I know.
Uh,
I know.
you know, it's like I was just talking to somebody today, and we were talking about uh, some of these different cases that are out right now. And of course, you've got like Rex Huerman, the Long Island serial killer
Mm.
that they're looking at that's getting ready to come to trial. And we don't really know the information about that. I've been looking into it, but I
Yeah.
don't know it well enough to really
Right.
make a stance on it.
Right.
I will tell you that there is an upcoming episode of the podcast about that,
Yeah.
where I
Yeah.
am going to do a little bit more research and dig into it a little bit because I think it's a fascinating case. However, I've studied a lot about the Delphi case, and I've talked about that a bunch. I have a bunch of opinions about that. But my opinions are founded from actual court documents and
Right.
things that were not
Right.
presented in court.
Right.
So, there are a lot of people out there who just listen to all the talking heads, whether it's pro prosecution or pro defense. But if
Right.
that's all you're listening to and you're not looking at the real evidence, there's a problem. You don't really
Yeah.
know the case.
Yeah, the best-selling book I've ever done is the book I did about the St. Louis exorcism in 1949. Now, this is written by a guy who, myself, spent like 25 years researching this story. One who was still alive, including the boy who was alleged to be possessed. I When I finished with it, it's the same way I present it in the book, and whenever I speak about it, I present it the same way. I don't have the answer. I don't even know that I believe in demonic possession. But what I do believe is that something happened to this kid and to his family and to all the people involved, or that we wouldn't still be talking about it 75 years later. I wouldn't be seeking out surviving witnesses because no one would still be talking about it if something hadn't happened. But I always tell everybody, listen, here's the information. I'm going to give you everything that I've been able to find and what I know about this, and then you can decide for yourself what you want to believe. And that's how I leave it. And I think that we have to do that with anything that is, you know, pre-DNA for starters. I mean, every time we see another, oh, we've solved the identity of Jack the Ripper thing, I don't even bother to read it anymore. It's so dumb that, oh, we're going to base all this on some DNA found on a shawl, which may not even belong to the woman and have been handled 1,000 times over the years. How
Yeah,
in the world could you possibly get any usable DNA off that? You can't, but it sounds
yeah,
good on TV.
yeah.
So, but they
That
present
whole
it
thing.
as the, be all and end all of information. That and DB Cooper. Give me a break already. Leave this alone. We're never going to know. Can't we just leave it as it was an event that nobody got hurt? And it was something that, well, okay, Jack the Ripper. I'm talking about DB Cooper now.
Yeah,
I have moved on to another subject. Nobody got hurt, and it was a tremendous stunt. And we're never going to know who it was. There's no way we're possibly going to know for sure. So
yeah,
quit saying you've solved it. You haven't. This is my
yeah,
new take on it. This is my theory. I mean, I present a lot of theories in my books. I'll get to the end and I'll go, well, here's what I think happened. But I don't really know, and neither does anyone else. So yeah, I don't know. That kind of stuff drives me crazy. It just does.
yeah.
So my
So
pet peeve.
I have talked to Russell and plan on having him come on here. I've also done some stuff with Michael Hawley, who is also a ripperologist.
Mhm.
And I'll be completely honest with you that Hawley, after talking to him and looking at the evidence that he has about Tumbledy, sold
Yeah.
me on Tumbledy.
Yeah.
Uh, I
Yeah.
I had always been
I
in
could
the
buy that one. I could buy him more than most of the others. I mean,
yeah,
I just want it to be a Freemason just because I love that whole mystique on the Freemasons in the late 1800s and how they would cover it up for another member, but I don't really think it is, but I would
yeah,
love for it to be,
yeah,
with all the secret symbols and all this stuff that, I mean, obviously somebody really read into that, but it's fun. It's
yeah.
entertaining, It's entertaining because it's more than 100 years old. If this had happened 5 years ago, we wouldn't call this entertaining. But it's entertaining because it's something cool, and there's a mystique to it. But yeah, Tumblety, who's a complete nutcase anyway, that one is really interesting to me. I will admit I like the idea behind that's a possibility. So
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and there are people that they say because Tumblety was not into women at all, right?
right,
He was
right.
predominantly into men, which seems very, very strange. But he was also very violent towards women,
Yes.
which was
Like
interesting.
collected uteruses as a
I
hobby.
know,
I mean,
like who does
that's
that?
a red flag there, you
Yeah.
know.
Uh, and so, he brings up a really interesting point that I never really thought of before, talking about trying to create the elixir of life.
Mm,
So
interesting.
there were certain pieces that were taken from each of the victims that may have been experiments used
Yeah.
to cure things that he was having problems with in his own life, because he
Mhm.
also had syphilis.
Right.
So, he was trying to figure out a cure for that. And so that may have led to some of that. But then the big thing to me is that there are 30 plus murders that happened here in the States, very, very consistent to the murders that happened in England,
Yeah.
and all where Tumblety was,
Yeah.
right? He was
Well, and
there.
what makes it interesting is from that time period on through about 1920, every series of murders that happened was some kind of ripper, was the something ripper, the Atlanta ripper,
Yeah.
and the ripper murders in Atlanta were interesting. I don't know that I would compare them so much to Jack the Ripper as I would the ones that happened in Austin, Texas, a few years earlier. So I did a book on the Midnight Assassin, whatever name you want to give them. There were a lot of them, and I actually compare the murders that happened because they're really, as far as motive goes and the way that they occurred. The ones that happened in Austin were really close to what happened in Atlanta a few years later. I think maybe there was, and again, that's just a theory. I don't know, but it's an interesting comparison between the two. But they tried to draw, and say when they started talking about Jack the Ripper being an American, they started saying, "Oh, it's the guy from Austin," and that went around for a while because there were cowboys in England, in London at the time, traveling with Buffalo Bill. And so, wild Texas cowboys, they're, carry around those big knives. They probably are killing, prostitutes. And, it was just crazy stuff. But, everybody, all the comparisons were always to Jack the Ripper, always, no matter where they happened. And, there's some really interesting things to look at there, and but again, I'm not going to stand around and say I know for a fact,
Yeah.
and
I
because it's interesting stuff.
it's fascinating to me that a story, not just a story, a real account, but you're talking about a person who killed for less than 6 months, right? In 1888, only killed five people that we know of for sure.
For sure, right.
The five canonical Ripper
Mhm.
murders, but ended up getting a moniker that has proved to stand the test of time,
Oh yeah,
who
yeah,
everybody is compared to. And
yeah.
it's like, how in the world did this happen
I
on this
know.
little shitty street in Whitechapel, London?
Oh, I
Right?
know. I know. Yeah,
It's
it's
just
amazing.
amazing.
Yeah, it really is. And how it became this cultural touchstone is baffling to me. It really
Yeah.
is. I agree with you. I don't know how it happened. But I mean, they would use, compare it to Jack the Ripper, but then they would give like, Jack the Strangler and, Jack the Stripper. And I mean, just
Yep.
all kinds of stuff. And it's like, how, what, why, why?
Yeah.
I'm sure someone has probably looked at the cultural references, somewhere. I haven't seen it, but I'm sure it's out there. I would love to see a list of how many, how many there
Uh,
are. You
You know,
know,
it's not dissimilar from of course, now you're talking 60 years later, but Ed Gein, right?
Well,
Ed
sure.
Gein
Yeah.
has literally influenced the
Yeah.
entire genre of horror that we
Right.
know now.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
it is unbelievable to me. And this is a guy who, as far as we know, we can only prove that he killed two people,
2 people.
right?
He's not
Two
a
people.
serial killer. I keep telling everybody that people go, "Oh, it was a serial." No, Ed Gein was not a serial killer. He only killed 2 people that we know of, and probably that was it, you know?
Yeah.
Never went anywhere, so it would have been hard for them to go unnoticed, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, he never left home, you
Well,
know?
and then his motivation for killing was so much different. Both of the killings were almost accidents to begin
Yeah.
with.
Yeah.
He did not go out there like planning on killing anybody.
Well,
He
no.
was a
He
he
didn't
was a
even bother
grave
to try to
robber.
hide it. I mean, he would,
Yeah,
like, literally just drag him out to his truck and drive away. I mean, he could have been caught at any time. The fact that he didn't just goes to show you how dense the people were in that tiny little town at the time, where everybody
yeah,
just minded their own business, you know? And otherwise, he should have been easily caught, you know,
yeah.
but he wasn't. Well, until, a son comes in and say, "Hey, my mom is missing." And there was a blood trail going out the back, and there's a receipt on the counter with Ed's name on it. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
That is not a criminal genius at work,
No.
not at
I
all.
do I do have up on my wall right next to me here, next to my Life magazine with Manson on it.
Yeah.
I've got the
Okay.
detective stories from August of 1956, which
Nice.
is if you look at any of the photos that the police took of Ed Gein's barn, is one of the magazines that was sitting in his barn.
Yeah.
And so I have that up on my wall here. Uh, you know,
Yeah.
so it is a fascinating story, and I love this idea of and I mean honestly, it's why I wrote my book, understanding like all the cultural implications of these crimes that have happened
Right.
and how it changes us and it shapes our narrative and how we live our lives is fascinating and so far reaching that just like Jack the Ripper and Ed Gein and the Black Dahlia murders, that is another one that has really kind of shaped the narrative
Yeah. And
of the
again,
time.
it's one murder. It's one murder. I mean, yeah,
Yeah,
there were other things similar going on at the time, which probably helped it become part of the culture of LA at the time because of some of the other murders that were happening, but not connected to Beth Short. Here's one murder. Why are we still talking about this after all
yeah,
this time? Well, it's one reason would be because it was never solved and she was pretty. Period. That's it. I mean,
yeah.
I think that's a big part of it right there. And I friends with Catherine Ramsland, who's written, a lot of stuff. And I ran into her. This has been years. Well, it's been a good 10 or 12 years ago now. And I had gone to Gettysburg to visit friends to hang out for the weekend, and Catherine was there, and I had just gotten Beth Short's face tattooed on my back. And so and of course, my friend who was with me, we both knew Catherine. And she said, "Oh, you got to show Catherine your new tattoo." And so I showed it to her, and she's just like, "Oh, Troy." And I'm like, well, I mean, it's one of my favorite stories. She goes, "What is it with you? What is it with men and Beth Short? What is it with this whole fallen angel thing?" And she just went on and on about, about why are we so obsessed with this? And, and it's like, I've never lived that down with her, in fact. But anyway, it is something that it's a fascinating story. It just is, and I don't know why we're so obsessed with it. I mean, and I don't really know what it is. I just don't. It's just that handful of stories that Ed Gein, the I don't know. You can't look at the numbers. You can't say it's a sheer number of murders or connected murders or string of, and then there'll be something else that comes along that we're just as messed up and just as evil, and yet we don't talk about them the same way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why aren't people obsessed with, Carl Panzerim or something?
Yeah.
You just don't hear much about that stuff. I ran across this, out of the blue by accident, I ran across something called the Bridgeport Stabber a few years ago. And it turned out that for months, there was a guy going around Bridgeport, Connecticut, stabbing women. I'd never heard of it before. And he had like 27 victims. Now, he didn't kill them, but that's not really the point is that this guy was obviously crazy. And it's a really interesting story once I started collecting all the newspaper articles and writing it, but no one ever talks about it. I'd never heard of it. And so why does one thing, become part of our zeitgeist and something else doesn't? I don't get it.
Yeah. I know, I go around and I do 30 plus conventions a year. And I'm telling you, for all of you out there, every single show that I go to, I hear about these local stories and these people that I would have never, ever heard of because nobody talks about them.
Nobody talks about them.
And some of them are really, really big cases. Even here in Indiana, and some people have heard of it because there was a recent documentary that came out. But Fox Hollow Farm.
Oh, sure.
But that case in and of itself, and I'm struggling to remember his name.
Herb
Baumeister. Yeah. So like very few people know him by name, but this is a guy where they're literally still finding decapitated bodies on the property. They've never found the head
throughout the property. Yeah.
And it's like, this is a guy who again was homosexual. He was married, had a family, but he would go out and he would meet these men and have sex with them, feel guilty about it, kill them, cut off their head, and bury their body.
Yeah,
and,
on his farm. Very successful businessman around Indianapolis. And I found out about that story not because of the murders. I'd never heard of him before. I found out about it probably 15 years ago because the people who moved onto the farm said the house was haunted. And you invited us to bring groups there for ghost hunts. That's how I even found out. I never heard of this guy. And then as time went on, and of course, I started to hear more of the story. And then, Richard Estep, who I know wrote the book that the documentary is based on, and Richard dug into it even more. And I've talked about him here and there. I wouldn't call myself an expert on him by any means, but I'd never heard of him. It was the ghost stories that is what got me involved in the story at all, or even knew to know about it at all. So it's crazy how weird things pop up, and just like you said, you go to these towns and somebody says, "Hey, do you know anything about this story?" And I'm like, no, but then you start digging and sure enough, the information's out there. It's just a matter of finding it,
I was the last show that I was at in Kansas City. I was there and a lady came up to the booth and she started describing some murders that happened up in Chicago of these three women that did it together. She mentioned that the one lady was her great aunt, and that she was like a seer. And I was like, oh, yeah. And I'm like, so I knew the story as soon as she said that.
Yeah.
But nobody knows that name.
No.
She's in Killers the card game. She's in the Lady Killers expansion. So I got to talk to her great niece and show her Tilly's picture in the game. She was very excited.
Oh, wow. That's one of those stories that I ran across that in some old collection of like detective magazine articles that had bound into something like in the 50s. And that's how I found it. I thought, well, that's a really interesting story because it's got this kind of supernatural edge to it with her claim that I could predict the future too if I tell you that you're going to die next week and then I poison you. Yeah, I can predict the future. But it was an interesting story. And then but it just doesn't pop up much.
Yeah.
I did like an episode of like Deadly Women, and they asked me to talk about it, and I said, "Oh, I can handle that one."
Yeah.
That's one I know. So, but yeah, it's not a story that most people are familiar with.
Yeah.
It's not. So
It's just wild that I end up running across her great
yeah,
niece
yeah, no
like
kidding, no
at a
kidding.
show, and she's like describing it to me, and I'm like, I know that story.
Well, I can give you another weird example of meeting someone's relatives, and you probably saw this because you're reading that book. But I had known these two ladies for years, Brenda and Beth Peinzel, and I never thought twice about it until they one day mentioned, well, I don't know if you know this or not, but we have a relative, our great grandfather, who was kind of infamous. And I said, really? And it was Benjamin Pitezel, Holmes's accomplice. So
Yeah.
they're like, here's a whole bunch of papers and photographs and stuff. If you'd like to look at it, I'm like, look at it. Yeah.
That's
So
incredible.
if it wasn't for them, I probably would have never written anything. I mean, I probably would have written something, but not what I ended up writing about Holmes, because I know his great granddaughters.
Yeah.
I don't. They were that lived, the ones that didn't go off with Holmes. So it's weird how that stuff pops up sometimes. It
Yeah.
just is, and you never. I mean, now on the other hand, I've taken, I don't know how many tours to the site of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago. And if I had $1 for every time I've taken a tour there and someone comes up to me and tells me that their grandfather, uncle, or someone was a driver for Al Capone, I could retire.
Yeah. Yeah.
Everybody wants to be a piece of that story. So,
Yeah.
and I always end up thinking, how many drivers did this man have? I've heard it so many times.
Yep. I've heard at least 4 of those this year
Oh
at
yeah.
the
Oh yeah.
booth. So
Easy. Or
yeah.
it's, Illinois, anywhere, especially around Chicago, but anywhere in Illinois, Al Capone slept here is kind of like Abraham Lincoln slept here. It's
Yeah.
pretty much the same thing. And you're thinking, there's no way that Capone went to all these places. There is why would he come to this town? He would not come to this town. But I think I always try to tell people that, listen, and you try to break the news as easy as you can. Probably wasn't Al Capone, but it could have been just some gangster. And because Al Capone's the one everybody's heard of, that your family somewhere along the line filled in the name, but that doesn't make it any less cool. That's what I leave them with,
Yeah.
because, there's
So
plenty of gangsters out there. I mean, not all of them are Al Capone.
so it's funny that you mentioned that specifically, because that happened to me and my own family. So my house I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware.
Okay.
And so my house there, there was a legend, we have a dirt basement there, and that it was owned by somebody related to Dahmer, right?
Oh,
And so I'm like,
what?
how is that
Weird.
possible?
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't know anything about that. But anyway, as I got older, I researched the story a little bit more. So obviously it was not Dahmer that lived in my house.
Yeah.
However, it was the uncle of Stephen Pinnell, who was the only serial killer from Delaware.
There you
So
go.
like it does have a relation, but just like you said,
Yeah.
over the years, people interchange that because the Dahmer name is legendary. Nobody who knows who the hell Stephen Pinnell is.
Right. Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. You got to be a local for that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good point. Good point.
So it's interesting that you would say that, because I've
Yeah.
experienced that in my own life.
Yeah.
It's funny, but we always did wonder about the basement.
Well,
Like,
yeah. I do. Yeah.
there's a dirt basement. I don't know what's down there.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Catherine Ramsland, and I know Catherine too.
Yeah.
We have a funny history, but I actually went to her when I was creating my game, The Profiler.
Okay. Oh,
and
yeah,
uh, and I,
perfect.
and I went to her to ask her because she did all the CSI stuff, and I was like, "Hey, I really want this to be as accurate as possible. What resources? Because you are the authority on all of
Oh,
that.
yeah,
I
for
was
sure.
like, what resources do you have?" And she put me on to several of her books that she had written. One of them is a textbook. I now own all of them,
Yeah.
and I used those for reference material for the game, and it came out really really well.
Nice.
Uh, I was at a show in at the Ohio State Reformatory,
Mhm.
and my buddy Mark Nisbet was there. Now,
Yeah,
Mark,
yeah. I know Mark.
of course,
Yeah.
yeah,
Known
owns
him
all the
forever
ghost
too.
tours.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that him and Catherine are really good friends. They wrote a
Oh, yeah,
book
that's
together.
well, it was at his house that I ran into her in my story. It was at Mark's house.
Yeah.
That's
So
funny.
so Mark told me he was like, dude, I wrote a book with her, and one of the things that I was working on at the time, and I'm still working on it, but I wanted to do a true crime paranormal show, and so I was working on all of that, and I had no idea that they had collaborated and written a book on that
Mhm.
subject. So Mark ended up giving me a copy of the book. I have it on my bookshelf here, but just really funny. we're
Yeah.
we're sitting there and we're talking about it. Uh, because Mark's a great guy, him and his
Oh,
wife.
yeah. Yeah.
I've spent a bunch of time with them at because they always come up. Well, not always, but a lot of times they come up for Parapsychon,
Yeah.
and they're there at the convention. So
Good. Yeah, I've had him out to my they're great.
yeah, I mean, he's been in the paranormal world and running ghost tours
Yes.
for longer, I think longer than I've been alive.
Oh, he's a good guy. He really is. So,
Yeah, yeah, really good dude. So, what is your favorite story out of all the ones that you've done?
mm, probably, story-wise, probably the axe murders that, almost in Bolivia, there, in Iowa. That story about those murders, but that's not, I always try to explain to people, they, well, that's the whole story. I said, well, it's really not, because there were a couple more after that before, because I'm sure it's the same guy. I was just writing about Velisca because I had gone out there to visit and got interested in writing about those murders, and I got to know the owners of the house back when Darwin Lynn, who is the one who renovated the house in the 90s. When he was still alive, I got to know he and his wife Martha pretty well, and so I spent a lot of time out there researching the story. But I want to kind of I was
And
in the 1800s because you had to have one for your fire and everything else. So it became this consultant with. So I just really wanted to kind of include some history behind that before I got into the murders in Belisca. But when I started digging through newspapers, I kept finding these identical murders that matched Velisca to a T. I mean, like little bitty small things that were the exact same MO, with the lanterns turned down, and on top of the oil, the same. And I
I
Velisca,
am okay.
you
I'm
still there?
losing you.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, we're going black here for some reason. Anyway, there were several murders that matched perfectly, that started in Colorado Springs and then continued on that year into Villisca, and then a couple more that happened afterward. And became convinced it was the same guy, and laid it all out there. And then after that, there was a book that came out from a big publisher that also used this, but at least he credited me with, which, thank you for that. At least after I, spent like years putting this together, thanks for at least crediting me. But that really became sort of my favorite story, because it's such a fascinating story anyway. And people are, it's again one of those things where people will hear something about it on TV and assumed it was solved because, they put that preacher on trial. Yeah, he was batshit crazy, but he didn't kill anybody. It was, and so it's one of those stories that for me never really went away. I've just remained fascinated with it. And again, it was kind of like, the Fox Hollow Farm story. I only heard about it because of the ghost stories. And then that's how I got into the history behind it. And it turned out that the history is much more fascinating than just the ghost stories are. And that happens a lot with this kind of stuff, I find. But yeah, that's probably would be my favorite if I had to name one. So
Nice.
yeah.
So, I always think it's really interesting because, I kind of travel all the different worlds too. And, when you look at the ghost stories and the paranormal side of things, I always think it's interesting that there's like, there often can be a stigma between the paranormal people and the true crime people. And I've never really understood that because, like, without the true crime, you don't really have the
You wouldn't
paranormal.
have the ghost story. Yeah. And yeah, I agree with you. And it's the same way without you can even just go beyond that and say it's not just it's history in general. I mean, people say, oh, you're history in books. Well, there wouldn't be a ghost story without it. So why is that a problem? Or I don't
Yeah.
understand, and the true crime stuff is the same way. Now I'm not going to say that I don't have some books that are just almost strictly true crime because I do. I really like the historical stuff. I'm pre 1950 kind of stuff is really what floats my boat the most. But there's also a lot of ghost stories connected to all of those murders too, just for the same reason, that's the reason that the ghost stories are there. So for a while, I had a real audience issue with that, with too much true crime, but it seems to resolved itself over the last maybe 5 years or so. Actually, I think what it is that during the pandemic, when we couldn't do anything but put out books, that's all we could do, and people would buy them because they didn't have anything else to do. Now they just sort of accepted the fact that they're going to get a bunch of true crime from me, so they just buy them anyway. I think maybe that's what happened, but that's okay. I'm okay with that. So
See
I
that?
both aspects of it. So that's what I do. So.
Yeah. Well, see that's exactly what happened to me. I put out Killers the card game just after the pandemic, right?
Mhm.
And so it ended up being like this perfect wave where people were now getting back into tabletop gaming because they
Right.
had nothing else to do.
Right.
And I was at a place where true crime was kind of with social media and everything else and all
Mhm.
the documentaries coming out.
Yeah.
It was right at like its apex.
Yeah.
So it was easy for me to do that, even though there have been several true crime games before mine that were not very successful because they got banned or
Yeah.
people got
Right.
really
Right.
upset about it.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I have been the most successful with that. We've done really, really well. And so it's been, kind of crazy to me that I just caught it at right the sweet spot, where I've been able to like really make a platform from that. And, it went in from the game to now multiple games into my book and then now into the podcast. And it's just been, riding the wave
Yeah.
and learning like what works and being able to express myself in all the things that I love and really turning my own personal passions into my work.
Yeah.
And it's
Oh,
been
yeah.
it's been
Yeah.
really kind of cool to be able to do that.
It is. It is. Yeah. I can't imagine doing anything else. I mean, that's literally all I've ever done. And I don't know how I would do something else at this point. I mean, I always tell everybody that I'm unemployable now, because I've been spoiled by just doing what I want all this time.
Yeah. So so yeah, what do you have coming up here in the future? Because I know you said you've got a ton of things on the horizon.
I
Uh-oh, you're like frozen again.
I know going on, but we keep each black on our screens here bode well, because in a few minutes I have to record a podcast. So good. It all gets worked out. A book about the trunk murderess, story that has always fascinated me. I had done an episode of the podcast about it, and I had a lot of people asking me about, I kept saying, there's a lot more to this story, but we'd be here all day if, I did it. And to do is a lot crazier than, the short version of a podcast can present. This woman, boy, what a story. Anyway, so I've got a music book coming out, murder ballads, true crime stuff coming out. And then I don't know. It's going to be whatever I decide to finish next. See, it's like I have several things in the various processes of being done, and I've done research on this. Here's all my material, but I haven't written it yet, or et cetera, et cetera. So I just have to decide what I want to finish next. So and then off it comes. So,
I think I need to like adopt your approach, because like beyond the headlines, I've currently got 5 volumes planned, right?
Right.
And so like I'm currently working on volume 2 now,
Right.
but like I find that like I get to roadblocks, right, in my own brain.
Sure.
But like it may just be at that moment I'm really, really interested in the assassination stuff. So what I ought to do is I ought to just write all of them at the same time, and whatever is floating my boat at the moment, I write about that, and then I go back to whatever.
Then decide what order they're going to be in. Yeah. I mean, it's literally what I do. I don't always start on, say, the 3rd or 4th book down the list, but I've been researching it, and I've been, putting together material, and I've been on newspaper rabbit holes, and that's often what I do. And then I just decide this is what I'm going to finish. So off we go. And I usually like whatever it is I'm writing about enough that I'm going to finish it no matter what anyway.
Yeah.
So I just figure, I've had some stuff that have been sitting on my list for 10 years, and I'll get to it eventually, but I'm just not ready for it yet. I'm just not ready yet, but I'll get there, And so somebody asked me, what's the longest you've had a book? And I think it was like 14 years it had been on my to-do list.
Wow.
Before I finally finished it. Yeah. So you just never know,
Yeah. It is definitely not an exact science.
No. Well, that's why I like it. If it was science, I'd hate it. So,
well, you figure like, if you look at somebody like Stephen King, who has 80 plus books now, right? And, we're not talking about, 300-400 page books.
Oh, no, we're talking about, doorstop, books.
And so you look at that and that he has manuscripts that he's been working on for 20 years that are in different various stages of development. And then all of a sudden he gets inspiration. He's like, okay, that's how I need to finish this.
Right.
If you believe King ever finishes anything, that is also up for debate. But I'm a huge avid King fan. Like,
me too.
I have every book that he's ever written. Most of them first editions, and I'm a fan. My favorite book of all time is It. It's the one I grew up on.
It was maybe the second one I read. I think Night Shift was the first one I ever read, the short stories. And I think that is what hooked me after seeing like a couple of the movies, I think. But then I read It was the first real big novel that I read. Yeah. So
when I was a kid, I would go to the library, the Wilmington Public Library, and I would get out It. And I have literally read It over 100 times.
Oh man.
Like, there are parts of the book that I can recite.
I'll bet.
So, but it is, this is a classic coming of age story.
Sure.
And it was very easy as, a young person growing up, you know, at like 8, 9 years old when I started reading it, to really fit into the roles that were going
Oh
on in
yeah,
the book,
sure.
and to want to live in this, you know, quasi fantasy world where all the monsters were coming to life.
Right.
And, you know, I thought it was just such a great concept, and it has stuck with me my entire
Yeah,
life.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It is.
So,
It's a fantastic one. So yeah, I about that same time I discovered Boy's Life by Robert McCammon. I'm sure you've probably read that too. And it was another one of those things that kind of went hand in hand with it, but not quite as malevolent, you know, but it still had that to coming of age, weird things, and yeah, I think those two probably shaped definitely had a way of shaping my childhood for sure.
yeah.
So,
I
yeah.
mean, you look at, and I'm sure you probably watched this movie too, but Stand By Me,
Oh, yeah.
uh, you know, this is the classic coming of age story from
Yeah.
King, and just an incredible tale. I ended up, well, he's a character all on his own, but oh my goodness, I can't think of his name now. But he's stayed with Michael Jackson for some time. Corey Feldman.
Corey Feldman.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and he is an interesting person.
Oh, I'll bet.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. He seems like he's
I,
very interesting. Yeah.
yeah, I went up to him one time, and I got his autograph, right? And I go up there, and he asked me a question. So I'm in mid sentence answering his question, right? And then he saw a girl next to me, and he immediately paid attention to her. He didn't say one other word to me.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
handed me back my stuff and never even looked at me
Yeah.
again. And I was like, "Well, thanks, Corey. Thanks. I appreciate that, brother."
Yeah.
Oh goodness. All right, man. Well, thank you so much. Do you have anything else that you want to share?
No, I've just got check out the website. How's that? I think we're supposed to, don't we end with promoting ourselves? That's how we always do it. Monies.net. You can find books and all the information. We got the Haunted America Conference coming up in June. In June, it is our 28th year. We are the oldest ghost conference in the United States. So continuous except for COVID year. But other than that, we've been doing it every year and fun. Richard Eastep will be there. Speaking of people I mentioned in the show. So yeah, it's going to be fun, but and this has been fun and we got to do this again. We know way too many of the same people that I don't know how we haven't done this before. But we'll definitely have to do it again. So.
Yeah, I have had drinks with Richard.
Yeah.
And Richard is hilarious
He is
when he is
absolutely.
intoxicated.
Yeah, he's hilarious anyway, but yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Oh my God. So we were at Michigan Paracon together,
Mm-hmm.
and it was the very last Michigan Paracon last year.
Right.
And so we're there, and everybody is wasted. And I was up there with Tim Dennis, right? With he has Darkness,
Oh yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
He has that podcast, and so we were all hanging out, and I happened to look down at the floor, and if you've ever been to the hotel, the casino that Michigan Paracon is done in, for whatever reason, their floor, their carpet has little dicks in it. And I looked down, and I was like, Tim, man, you see these dicks on the floor?
Yeah.
And so Tim is dying laughing, and he is grabbing everybody and telling them, "Do you see the little dicks on the floor? You see the dicks on the floor?" And he grabs E-Step and brings him over, and E-Step says, "I see no dicks on the floor." And Tim, I think you have lost your mind. And he spends 20 minutes telling Tim how he is too drunk to understand that there are no dicks on the floor.
Right.
And, oh my God, it was hilarious. And I tried to do my best to make sure that he did not know that actually came from me.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it's like, please don't put that on me. I didn't do it. But yeah, so yeah, and one of these days, your convention is not going to fall on a weekend where I'm already otherwise busy, and I will be there because I have been trying for like the last 3 years,
Well,
and
what
every year I end up.
I'll try to make sure that you can work something out soon. So
Yeah.
I mean, Indiana is not that far, so
Yeah, no, not at all.
yeah,
Cool, man.
it's the
Well,
other side of Illinois.
I will make sure that I put all of the relevant links in the description so everybody can find your stuff. But I appreciate it, man. Thanks for coming on. And
so
yeah, great to finally get to talk to
no
you
kidding.
sort of face to face.
Actually talk. Yeah. Sounds good.
Cool, man. Absolutely.
All right, well, take care. And I will
talk
to you soon. All right.
Absolutely. I will talk to you soon. All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us for this this episode of True Crime Myths, Legends, and More. Make sure that you go and check out Troy's stuff. He has got an incredible amount of stuff. Go and check out the museum if you're in town or driving by that way. I mean, even if you're 25 miles away, you should make a detour and go there. Call it like a roadside attraction, right? We all love that stuff. So go and check that out. Go and check out the conference. I have been wanting to do it for several years now, and eventually I will get there myself, and you can come and see me there. But it is, he does some incredible stuff. So check it out. Thank you guys so much. Remember, next week we will be doing our live recap of this episode. So make sure that you jump in on that. I will have Mary and Sherry here. We'll be talking about all things spooky and ghosty and true crime and more. So make sure you hit us up with that, and I will see you guys then. And I might find the end. There we go.